In this video, I'm going to give a detailed tutorial of how to make a small bowl. The requirements of the brief are that the bowl be less than 5 inches in diameter and be used for holding coins and spare change. I have a series of discs that I use to measure diameters in 1/2 inch increments. The 5-inch one should be here somewhere, but I'm going to make this bowl 4.5 inches. Oh, my 4.5 inch one isn't labelled, I'll have to fix that. My usual source of timber is the firewood pile, so I'll just go out there and see what I can find.
A bit cracky.
This first piece has too many cracks. This one though looks better. I'll bring it in and cut a blank to have a look. I use the disc to guide the bandsaw blade when cutting the blank. I like to keep the flat side of the log on the bandsaw tape. This piece has a lot of cracks, but I might just get a small bowl out of it. We'll give it a go and see. I mount the blank to my faceplate using a single coach bolt. For a small piece like this, that'll be plenty strong enough. My lathe is outside, so there's less dust, and while the weather's okay, I prefer to work out there to keep the dust to a minimum. I put a little dab of oil on the faceplate to stop it from binding hard and being difficult to get off. This red gum is really hard timber, so I have to do a lot of sharpening. Now with a freshly sharpened bowl gouge, I'm going to take the corners off. Note the position of the flute towards me as I'm taking off the corners. I've also made a small tenon for reversing the bowl later. I'll explain more about that later on. Now I've stopped the lathe to have a look at progress, and I can see that this blank just has too many cracks. I don't want to spend more time filling cracks than turning, so I'm going to abandon this piece. And the bowl that wasn't. It's an important lesson to learn, I think, that really crappy wood's just not worth turning, and it's okay to abandon a piece because it's just not up to scratch. So I'm going back to my wood stash to have a look. Let's look in the other wood stockpile. It's of old burl, walnut with a lot of wormholes. The banks here probably not big enough. Some nice bird's eye figure there if I ever want to make some pens. Old bikes. It's a firewood that I've saved. No cracks in him. The little superficial ones here. It's a beautiful winter's day and this bird seems to be happy. This second blank looks like a better piece. Beautiful. Got a little crack in here. I don't even think that's a crack. I think that's just a bit of discoloration. The sapwood here. This time with non-splitty wood. First thing to do is to knock off the corners with the bowl gouge. Note the angle of the flute as I'm doing this. Then I have to flatten off the base with the flute turned away and the bevel going in the direction of the flat base. More shaping with the gouge, being particularly careful going across the end grain. I'm sharpening the gouge repeatedly off camera. You can hear when it gets dull by the dull sound it makes. I know I'm going to make a closed form with this piece, so you can see that I'm already bringing the top rim in. Not there yet. I switch to a spindle gouge with a fingernail grind to cut the tenon on the base that I will use to mount the bowl in the chuck for hollowing. You can see there are still some flat spots from the bandsaw, which I'll try to get out later. As it happened, one of these flat spots made it into the final piece as a sort of cameo. But it's really small and I'm happy to let it ride. It gives a little suggestion about the bowl's provenance. At this point, I'm making what I think is the most important decision when crafting a bowl, and that is checking the form. I'm looking at the profile of the edge, and I want it to be a nice smooth curve with a parabolic taper. It's this line that makes or breaks the design of the bowl. At this point, I'm going to show how I get the gouge to cut end grain relatively cleanly. I've remounted my cracky reject first bowl from earlier, and I'm going to cut across the end grain with the gouge. Firstly, I make sure it's nice and sharp. Then holding the gouge at about a 45-degree angle, I'm moving the whole chisel across the face of the cut in the direction of the bevel. The cut is being made in the very gully of the gouge as an angled slicing cut. I'm moving my whole body to keep the gouge at that particular angle as I move across the cut. It's the angle cut that's essential here to keep tear out to a minimum. You can see that the result gives small ripples in the finish of this very hard red gum, but there's only very small tear out in the parts of the cut that are coming up against the grain. Now let's go back to our good piece of timber. Turning the bowl over, it gets mounted by the tenon and I check that it's running true at a slow speed. Now I take off the corners and try to blend the curve on the outside before beginning to hollow. You can see I take a cut right around to finish this job off. Now it's time to start hollowing. Take note of the angle of the flute of the gouge as I'm doing this. The bevel is following the surface all the way along the cut. Notice too how much the angle of the handle of the gouge swings round as I'm taking the cuts. I'm still sharpening all the time. At this point I've already sharpened the gouge about 10 times. When starting the inside cuts with the gouge, it's important to make sure that the tip of the gouge starts inside the rim of the cut. The spinning bowl has a tendency to spin the gouge in your hand, and if you're inside the rim, you're safe. If on the other hand you're outside the rim or just on it, you can get a nasty catch, which will make a dig into your rim. That can force you into a redesign if you're not careful. There comes a point where the gouge doesn't let you get in under the rim enough or be at the right angle in the centre. This is the time to change to the scraper, again freshly sharpened. With a sharp scraper you should get shavings and be able to take the surface down quickly. I use 2 steel rulers to check the depth of the bottom. You can see how I do that here. Also, you can feel the wall width. It's easy to tell if it's widening or narrowing. It's harder to judge exactly how thick. This is a matter of experience, but if in doubt, get out some calipers and check. I'm going to put 3 little beads on the rim. This is tricky. I'm doing it with the fingernail gouge and being very careful. The grain can force the gouge to go somewhere that you don't want it to. Everybody hates sanding. These little pads are the best way to make it easier that I've come across. With this red gum, which is prone to all sorts of tear out, I always start with 80 grit and then go through 120, 180, 240, right up to 320. I blacken the beads with my ebonising gunk. It's a mixture of steel wool and cider vinegar. It's a good idea to keep the revs down low when you do this, or you can end up wearing a lot of black stuff in your face. I knew with this small bowl that I would be able to turn it over on the same jaws and grab it with the jaws in expansion mode. It's important not to use too much force for doing this mount or you can split the bowl. For this reason I always lock the chuck with its locking screw or it can lose grip from the spinning of the lathe. I use the spindle gouge to cut the small cove on the foot and flatten the base and start using a scraper to refine the form. But now the light's getting so bad that it's time to call it quits for the day. Next day I found some issues with it. Now, a couple of things I noticed overnight is that there are some small cracks in the surface of this bowl, just a few little ones, and I want to stabilise those before we go any further. But the good news is I have a brand new scraper arrive in the mail. To stabilise the cracks I use super thin CA glue. And it's good that it wicks in. Being very thin glue, it'll wick right down into that crack. There. And down on this side. Okay, I'll let that stabilise. Now my skew is the only tool I hone, mainly because it doesn't really need reshaping. It's incredibly hard steel, and it holds a really good edge. So all I need to do is touch it up on my sharpening stone. And my sharpening stone, first thing I ever did with the sharpening stone was put these 4 little cut-off nails in the bottom of it. If I put it on the bench, it doesn't move. WD-40, that stuff. And then I just get the angle and hone it by hand. I don't need to do a lot here. This is a bit hollowed out, so I sort of go across the grain that way, and then getting the camera's in the way a bit here. Just wipe that off. Top edge on that side and on that side. The thin CA is dried, but it's left a few gaps. This is where the thick CA glue comes in. Then I can just drop a bit in there and a bit on that side, and the thick CA will fill that crack up. You can see it's... Now, while we're waiting for the glue to dry, we can have a look at the state of play here on this bowl at the moment. If you look at the bottom, you'll see there's still some tear out here on the base, and then where I'm trying to fair these two curves into each other, you can see, I'm trying not to glue my hands to the bowl here, you can see there's still a bit of rough grain there. This red gum is notorious for tear out, and you can see the tear out here. This part's pretty smooth, that's where it'll be cutting with the grain. It cuts up against the grain. You see a little bit more tear out there. Just to prove it's never too late to learn anything, I've discovered the negative rake scraper. Since I don't have one, I use my skew, which I have to say does a terrific job. As long as I keep it sharp and it produces shavings, it does get rid of a lot of tear out.
You can see the surface there. It's got ridges in it, but there's no tear out, and that's the main thing. Every little tear out there and there.
Now it's more sanding to finish.
There.
And a bit more by hand on the rim to level those little fills of glue.
Just that.
A quick wipe with a cloth and it's ready for finishing.
Oh, the beads are nice and black again.
Good way to get shellac in there. Use a brush. We'll get it on there and give it a wipe. We don't want it being too thick. The brush also helps get the finish down in the grooves of those beads. We have gloves. Let's put this over the bottom. Yep. It's time to get sticky, time to stop rubbing. This is a really old can of linseed oil, and all I want is a drop of it. And I just want a tiny dab of linseed oil. Even that's probably too much for here. And then I'm going to pour the shellac also onto the pad that I've been using here. And now the linseed oil helps that rag glide across the surface. And you'll see the sheen start to come up. You can immediately see it start to shine up And the more you rub it, the shinier it gets. And a spot of beeswax and oil mixture. Wipe it on with a waxy cloth and wipe it off with a clean cloth.